Hello and welcome as you join us for this, our second LinkedIn Live in our Breaking Barriers series for Shape Talent. Great to have you with us. What I would love you to do, because I'm about to introduce myself and our guest today, but don't make us do all the hard work. Why don't you introduce yourself in the comments? Let us know where you're joining us from. If you like, tell us the organization as well as the physical location. Tell us what it is that has made you come today to look at the role of men in enabling gender equality, because that is our theme today. We will get onto that in just a second. But first of all, while you're saying hello to us, let's us say hello to you. My name is Rachel Schofield. I'm a senior facilitator with Shape Talent, which is an award-winning diversity, equity and inclusion consultancy working with global multinational organizations who are serious about gender equality. And no surprises today, because we're talking about the role of men in enabling gender equality. I'm joined by a man, none other than the brilliant Robert Baker, who is the CEO of Potentia Talent Consulting. And I'll give you a full rundown on Robert in a moment. But first, what can you expect? We're going to be here for about half an hour. I'm going to be interviewing Robert for about 25 minutes of that. But this is a conversation. The whole point of these LinkedIn Lives from Shape Talent around breaking barriers is to create a dialogue. You're going to hear each month from someone who is making a difference in supporting gender equity, often with not just insights, but practical strategies about how some of the big issues in that realm can be addressed. You may have questions. We welcome those. So we'll make some time for those at the end. Do use the chat to get those in. And we want each month to bring you fresh insights, fresh input to create that dialogue, to create that conversation. So that's enough from me, because this is a conversation. Let's bring in Robert Baker on this theme. As I say, Robert Baker, CEO of Potentia Talent Consulting, who's had a 40-year career in global HR consulting with Mercer. Robert, I know also you are a specialist in looking at talent, but specifically training and coaching male executives to become allies in the gender equity space. And also, your roots in that space go back a long way, meaning that you're now a trustee for UN Women UK, you're vice chair of European Women on Boards. I could go on, but let's hear it from you, because with all of those different hats, people might think, how does somebody who worked in HR consulting with Mercer get interested in the role of men in gender equality?
Yeah, thanks, Rachel. And hi, everyone. It's a real pleasure to be here with you. I think actually my interest in gender equality and equity, and we'll talk about the difference and the similarities in a minute, really came from when I was at Mercer and realizing that actually we had a lot of really great women in the organization, but actually, there was real scope for us to do more for the women in the workplace. And so when the Women's Network was set up, basically I got involved because I said, look, I think it's great to have men supporting this. And so we changed the name of the Women's Network to The Vine so that it wasn't called a Women's Network. And so men felt more comfortable coming along. We changed the topics of conversation so they were all very relevant to women and men. And so actually we got this discussion going right from the start there on how men can support women in the workplace to level the playing field. Now, one of the things I did want to say is we've used the words equity and equality interchangeably a little bit so far. And I think it is important for us to kind of recognize the difference there, because I think, equality is certainly about the outcome. We really want to get to a place where everyone's got equal opportunities and equal outcomes, etc. But equity, in a sense, is the means to get there. In other words, we should be prepared to do more for those that are either underrepresented or marginalized, etc. And that doing more is kind of like what we refer to as kind of equity. So they're very related, if you like, but also a little bit different. And I think the other thing we've got to mention is that, of course, we talk a lot about men and women. We also know that gender is not binary. And there's some fantastic talent out there, people that are non-binary, trans, etc. So it's really bringing all of this together, letting everyone feel involved. And of course, I guess the reason that I got involved in gender equity and equality is because actually gender equality is good for men too. And I realized that a while ago. And so that's kind of how I got engaged in it.
Yeah. And we'll talk a bit later about why it's good for men, why it makes sense for men to want to get involved in this. But why don't we start with some of the challenges, some of those key challenges that you see in gender equity?
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I think, again, looking at the different landscapes that we've definitely got the workplace, and I focus a lot on the challenges in the workplace. But I think we've also got to think about gender equality and equity at home, because actually gender equality starts at home in many cases, because women are still picking up the bulk of that mental load about, what happens in the home, who looks after the kids, who's caring for the elders, who's remembering birthdays and stuff like that. And so one of the ways that men can immediately show up with gender equity is to be doing more at home and doing their fair share, and also the fair share of the mental load. So I often start there. And what's interesting is we're seeing, I think, younger generations of men coming in doing that, and or realizing that they need to do it because they've got working partners, they've got kids they want to be in their lives. So there's a real motivation for them to be showing up there. And then of course in society too, because we want women to feel safe, we want women to have a voice, we want women to have a choice in society, and those issues are still needing to be addressed. As you said, I'm a trustee of UN Women in the UK. These are very much the themes of UN Women, and International Women's Day is actually, from a UN Women point of view, is all about investing in women to accelerate progress. And that investment in women that we need to do to help them feel safe, to have a voice, and to have a choice is part of that equity that we need to build. So we need to level the playing field for women, sort of at home and in society, but of course in the workplace as well. Because what we know, and we look at the data, okay, sort of 80% of executives are men, some 60% of line managers are men, and what we're seeing really is way too slow progress around that kind of change. And women are facing real issues in the workplace. Just look at LinkedIn. It's a fantastic, sort of place where you can find out what women are really thinking about what's going on in the workplace. And there's a lot of comments about how challenging it is for women in the workplace, whether it's the fact that it's a male-dominated culture or that men are mansplaining them. There's a marvelous post from Jeremy Stockdale about mansplaining this week. And of course, women of color are also saying the workplace isn't working for us. We're finding it even harder to thrive in the workplace. And so we've got to really be aware of those issues. And unfortunately, what's happening in the workplace is that companies are still prioritizing short-term performance over the longer-term value that can come if you have a more diverse and equitable workplace. And I think what we've got to do is look at that more. And it's interesting, BlackRock did a recent study that showed that businesses that are more diverse perform better and give better results. So we've really got to get those kind of messages across about this is central to business. It's not just a nice to do. And then I think we can start to level the playing field in the workplace as well.
Yeah, really interesting to have those kind of three pillars, the sort of at home, the societal, the workplace. I just was looking in the comments, Anna, picking up on your point about the mental load that women carry, saying, and the practical load.
Yes, absolutely, the practical load.
Oh no, I don't think that was. I think that was like a wry smile, not a criticism of what you've said, Robert. But do keep those comments coming. Things that resonate. Any questions that come up, I'm going to be keeping an eye on the comment box.
Rachel, one thing I just want to add, I think to level the playing field in the workplace, we've got to invest more in women, right? We've got to invest more in women's leadership programs, women's development opportunities. We've got to de-bias recruitment. We've got to create more opportunities for women to take on in the workplace, those stretch roles that enable them to make progress. And again, that's the equity part, okay? We've got to do more to level the playing field for women. And that sometimes causes backlash from the men, because the men go, oh my gosh, that means no more promotions for me because we're now got a target for having women at the top and all of that kind of stuff. So when I'm having conversations with men executives, I'm often also addressing that, sort of backlash that there might be, or the myth, if you like, that what's good for women and progressing women is going to hold men back, which of course is absolutely not true. Gender equality is actually good for men. We'll come on to that in a bit. But I just wanted to flag that point because that is a key issue.
Yeah, and actually it'd be worth us kind of leaning in a little bit there, because I'm guessing in the work that you do, when you're going in and you're working specifically with male executives, for example, but also talking to people of, as you mentioned, other generations as well, perhaps younger people in the workplace, you may meet men who look at you blankly as if to say, well, yeah, this is important, but why should I care about it? So when people sort of look at you as if to go, where's my role here? Why is this really important? Is that not a female issue? A great one, but it's kind of not in my purview. What's the answer to that?
Well, I think the answer to that broadly is it's important to their business, and it should be important to their business, and it should be important to them if they're thinking about their careers for the future. Because what we know from all the research is that the kind of leaders that organizations want now are the leaders that know how to do diversity and inclusion, that know how to run a gender balanced organization. So if you've got that skill set, then it's setting you well up to be a leader for the future. And so a lot of the work that I do with men in the workshops I'm running is to help them realize that actually if they want to be in the 50% of leaders in the future that will be men, they've got to up their game and be more aware of the issues of diversity and inclusion, how to create that more inclusive workplace, etc. And so actually there are real benefits for them, and it's getting that across to them as well. And so part of what I do when I run these workshops is to actually study and talk to the men about, like, so what is it that motivates you to get engaged in this? Because again, there's some really good research that I've been involved with, but also in the workshops, the men come back and say, well, actually, probably the number one thing is that men saying it's actually the right thing to do. So a lot of men feel it is the right thing to do, that we need to be focusing more on gender equity and gender equality. Some obviously say, well, I've got a working partner, or I've got daughters I'm concerned about, or some have got women bosses or peers, but it's trying to understand at the beginning part, what even motivates them to get interested in this topic. And then once they're interested in the topic, we can build on that with why it's good for them and then what they can do to make a difference.
Yeah. And when it comes to that action part, I'm imagining, there are lots of different approaches here, and some of them are at a very individual level of what individual men can think about, can be doing. But why don't we start, because you're working a lot with your Potentia Talent Consulting with organizations. When you go in and the organization says, well, how can we engage men in this conversation? How can we, or non-binary people, how can we kind of broaden the whole issue of women's equity and equality and get people involved? What do you recommend to them?
Well, I very much recommend that they have conversations with the men in the workplace, and also that they're addressing the equity issues as well by, as I said, running women's leadership programs, etc. But I'm involved with a number of clients where they're specifically running programs for the men, because they've realized that if the men show up, there's that fantastic research from BCG, I think, that says that if men are engaged as allies in all of this work, 96% of companies in those environments make progress in gender equality, whereas it's only 30% if men are not engaged. So this whole concept of men becoming allies and allyship has become a really big thing. So I'm doing a lot of work around that at the moment. And as you'll see, I launched with Hira Ali a new program today with allyship around cultural and intersectional lenses, which are particularly important. But basically, it's about getting across that what men can be doing is helping to level that playing field, and that's where the concept of allyship has come in. So what we talk about typically in allyship is about providing support to somebody who's maybe less represented or marginalized in the workplace, which is why men have been identified as being good allies to women, because men are generally in positions of power and privilege, and therefore can play that kind of role. But actually, there's a lot of questions about whether that's a great concept, because it implies a power dynamic, if you like, and also even the word allyship can mean different things to different people. So I think it's about really recognizing we can all support each other, and that allyship is actually being there for each other. And I came across a really great quote from Janaya Khan recently about allyship is being there for someone in the way that you need the most when you were in your most vulnerable moment. So it's kind of putting yourself in the shoes of the other person and saying, I would have loved support in that moment. How can I support you? So, and what I mentioned was this research that shows that if you've got men and women, but particularly men leaders here, becoming allies, they're much more likely to advocate for women to be promoted. They're much more likely to advocate for women, even if they're not in the room, and they're much more likely to do things like insist on women being in the slates for, recruitment and stuff like that. So allyship really matters, and that's why I think organizations need to start with increasing the awareness of their men by running these kind of allyship programs, and then really helping the men understand what it is they can do to start making a difference, to really start showing up, to start to be part of that equity, if you like, of leveling the playing field.
Yeah. I'm going to come to the point that you alluded to there earlier about the role of leaders and senior men in organizations. But just while you raised that issue of the terminology, the lexicon that we're developing around this, you gave there a sense of that definition of allyship and one way of looking at it, but also mentioned that some people find it problematic and that they talk about advocacy or being an advocate. So what do you see as the nuance here, or the things that we need to be mindful of?
Well, I think, words are obviously important here, and I've kind of present this thing called the Allies Journey, which is a little bit around. We tend to start by being kind of a bit more aware and a bit supportive of gender equity and gender equality, and then we start probably to advocate more for it. And what do we mean by advocate? Well, maybe that means we're talking about it a lot more. We're trying to do a little bit ourselves. But the place that I'm trying to get most of the men that I'm working to is the agent of change, as I call it. In other words, it's really identifying that what we want is action and we want change, and that men can be part of that change, especially men leaders. So, I tend to look at advocacy is very important, but I think also to focus on that action part, to say, yeah, you guys need to really be doing things and be these agents of change. So, and I think it's about actually partnership with women and other genders in the workplace. It's not necessarily about men showing the way or leading on it. I mean, it's actually working together, because when we actually get men and women from the same organization in the room together, discussing how they can work together to create a more gender balanced environment, fantastic things happen, because they start to understand each other better. They start to understand each other's issues better, and then they start to come out with a resolution to build something which works for everybody, rather than what's historically done, which is just basically work mostly for, let's face it, mostly for white men. And now actually there's a real desire to change that so that organizations work for everybody.
Yeah, you're right. And you mentioned earlier about intersectionality as well, and how important that is in this conversation. Let's start to lean into the practicalities, because I know a lot of people who listen to our series, whether they're watching it live, hello, or on recorded version, great to see you, come from an HR background, or are people who are taking on a role, whether that's formally or informally in their organization, looking at issues like this. And they're thinking about, well, how do we do this? One of the things that we find at Shape Talent when we're working with big organizations, and I know it's something you experience as well, is when you're starting with any of these kind of programs or workshops, is getting that buy-in from people at a senior level, so at leadership level, or even at kind of exco level. So maybe you could talk a little bit about your experience of how important it is to get those kind of key people at leadership level to be on board with any program or initiative that you get underway.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And it is absolutely critical to have the supported from the top, and from the men typically at the top, really buying into it. And essentially, what I found is really helpful is to relate it to their business. And you say, like, what's your burning platform for why you need to be addressing this? Because otherwise it's kind of like a nice to do from a business point of view. And what we're seeing now is organizations saying, well, actually, we're having trouble recruiting and retaining women. And we're worried now that we're not getting ideas and perspectives that women bring in our organization. We're getting very much a sort of male-centric view of things, which, as we know, can be catastrophic if it's all, a men's view of what risk and return is. So bringing in these different perspectives, bringing in these different skill sets that women bring, organizations are starting to realize they need that, and they realize they're missing out if they're not organizations that are good places to work for women. I think also there's sometimes their customers are telling them, actually, you're not diverse enough. I know of an IT organization, for example, that lost a major piece of business because the team they sent into the client was all male, whereas the client was actually a diverse team. And so they realized after the fact that actually that wasn't very smart. So it was a real business reason in terms of customers to be showing out that way. And then I think just in general, in terms of the brand, you're all, these days, I think, especially if you want to appeal to an audience and your customers, and especially if those are younger generations as well, everybody's thinking more now about equity, equality, and everyone being involved. And if you're an organization that still feels like it's very monocultural, I think it's a real issue for you in future. And so I think you need to address that. And obviously, for some sectors, they even have regulators, like the financial services sector. The regulator is saying it's dangerous to have a culture which is too unbalanced. You've got to have these different perspectives. So I think it's establishing that business case for why these senior executives need to pay attention to it for their business, but it's also understanding why personally they might want to lead on this. And I think for some of them, it's about a legacy for the future. Imagine being able to take your organization and transform it to be future proof, if you like, because of the work that you've done as a leader on helping build that more diverse and inclusive workplace. And we can go on to obviously what men actually need to do to start making that happen, because there's some fascinating research which I'd like to talk about in a minute. But that whole bit about how do you get the senior executives engaged, you relate it to business, but I think you also relate it to them personally. And what I've found is if you get the CEO standing up, for example, before one of my workshops and saying, this is important to the company, this is important to me personally, and it should be important to you in the leadership team, you've got their attention.
Yeah.
So that CEO playing that role, making it clear to everyone that this is a key business issue that needs to be addressed, that's the way to get everyone's attention, get them bought in.
So let's go where you're heading, which is taking it down a level. So you get buy-in from leaders, but then at other levels, men who are sitting in their organization, whether they're very senior or not, thinking, well, what can I actively do? What is the kind of roadmap that you set out for them, or some of the strategies and actions that you're recommending?
Well, I think men at all levels can do things that can make the workplace better for women and for themselves, actually, for everyone. And a key part of that, I think, is just being more aware of what other people in the workplace are experiencing. I think men are typically pretty lucky because the workplaces have been designed by men for men. So we kind of live in this little privilege bubble where we don't see what it's like for other people, and we're often not aware of it. And one of the major things that often happens in organizations where we're working is we bring the voice of the women, the experience of the women out, and we highlight it, and we say, these are some of the challenges that women are facing in your workplace. How can you, as a man who's interested in showing up here, start to do something different? And one of the biggest things is that lack of awareness of what women's experiences are. So one of the things I often say to men at any level is, take time with a woman colleague or a group of women colleagues and listen to them. Listen to what they're saying. And you can use, for example, the fact you've been on this workshop or you've been on in this LinkedIn Live session to say, look, I've just experienced a really interesting session. I'd like to know what you think about this. What's your experience? Just get talking with them about that. I think that's the sort of start. And then I think the other thing is to think about, okay, so how do we do things like everyday things like meetings? Start watching a bit more. Are men diving in and man-interrupting, which is something that I think that Jeremy Stockdale post, as I mentioned, was great because it really brought out the number of women that said, oh my God, that's my daily experience of being interrupted by men in meetings. So I think as men, it's start to observe what's happening in meetings and what's happening with your own behavior. Are you finding yourself doing that? I mean, God forbid I found myself doing it the other day. So none of us are perfect, but it's recognizing those sort of things. And those are quite entry level, I think, in terms of listening, being a bit more about your behaviors. But then, of course, as you're going up the kind of the ladder, as it were, if you're a manager, then I think it's being more aware. Okay, so what are the women, for example, in your team experiencing when it comes to things like, for example, wanting to balance family and work, and for the men too, because increasingly now men want to balance that as well. So as a manager, how are you helping your teams to show up? And it's great to see companies actually now equalizing, for example, parental leave. I just saw that Morse Coulson have just equalized it in the UK, for example. Fantastic initiative. Now those managers in that organization can really start to think through, okay, how do we create an environment where men and women are taking parental leave and they're both equally, benefiting from it, and then having to realize the career, challenges that come with that. So it's things like that. And then when you really become into a kind of executive position, it's thinking through, well, how do I mentor women? How do I sponsor women? Obviously, sponsoring is a very powerful way of advancing women in the workplace and creating equity, because you take a woman's career and you take a big interest in her and you promote her, you talk about her, you really push her forward. So a lot of it's around that. And what I find when I'm doing workshops with companies, like the number of men actually mentoring at the moment or sponsoring a woman is low. Typically, it's often only about 10% of the audience. I say, put your hand up if you're mentoring a woman. Only 10% of them put their hand up. And I say, well, here's your biggest, lowest hanging fruit right, to start this mentoring of people in your organization, because that really brings so many benefits. And then I think the other thing is really start speaking up more. I think often what I hear from women is they're not hearing enough from the men leaders and the men managers about why this is important. And I think men have got to speak up more. And I think if you're in a leadership role, you have a duty to speak up about why this is important. And it helps women, I think, feel then more comfortable in the organization because they've got leaders around them who are supporting the cause and talking about it. Obviously, they need to do things as well. But I mean, this speaking up about it and being a public voice for change, I think, is a really important part of it as well.
Gosh, thank you, Robert. I know you've got lots of other things you could tell us about what people can be thinking about and doing. I just wanted to bring in Michelle's comment. I think Michelle Villar. She says, "So excited to see and hear Robert." And this is building on what you were saying. I'm sure this is something that you've talked about before. But together we discover that allies need a network to support and reinforce their speaking up and their sponsorship actions to be more effective and broaden their impact. So I guess that sort of that trickle down effect, that sense that even when you start, you kind of want to think, well, how can I bring more people on board with all of this? And just before I invite, just because I'm mindful we might have questions. So Robert and I, as you can see, can chat about this for ages, but we've just got a few moments left on this live. So if you have a question that you would like to put to Robert, then please use the comments, please use the chat. If you want to share something that resonated, if you're facing a challenge, again, if you're listening on playback, if you're not live but you want to share a comment, we would love to have those as well after the event. So I'm just going to keep an eye on that. But I wonder, just as we're heading towards the end of our time together, Robert, when we think about real success stories in this realm, and I know you probably can't speak at length about clients that you work with, but I wonder, when you see this done well, what you notice and how you feel about it, how you feel about the impact that your work is having.
Well, thank you. And I think, when it is done well, what I see typically, it goes back to this point we were making a while ago. It's supported from the top. So, the men leaders at the top and all the leaders at the top get the reason why this is important, and they devote time, and they also devote budget and resources to this. And what we need to make it clear here is what we're talking about in many organizations is a multi-year change program, basically, to try and change the culture to one where it's much more conducive to women and other groups to thrive, as well as the men. So there's a lot of change that needs to happen, and I think getting the buy-in and so the men at the top and the leaders at the top leading on this is absolutely critical. I think the other thing that's important is also to put these programs into place, the training programs. It's investing in these training programs for the women and the men so that they can learn better how they can play a part. It's doing things like setting up a network. So Michelle's talked about setting up a network. I'm working with a number of clients that have men as allies networks now, so that the men can work together and group with other allies too, to kind of support each other, basically, and to trade ideas. What works well for you, for example, and share that. So sort of those are some of the things I think they could do. And then I think the other thing is really to put it into goals and objectives. So it's amazing how many companies I talk to where we say, oh yeah, this is really important. And I say, well, is it in the leaders and managers goals? Oh no, it's not. So actually I think putting into performance goals, measure the performance on it, actually think about tying remuneration outcomes to it, like bonus, for example. A number of organizations are doing that, because that really gets the attention, as you can imagine. So those are sort of some of the things that organizations can be doing, and the things that I've seen generate most success. And then, very importantly, publicize the success stories, highlight the role models. So, for example, I'm working, with ENGIE, it's a French global energy company. They're highlighting really well the men that are showing up in this space, and those men are then role models to other men in the organization. So that whole highlighting the success stories is an absolutely critical part of creating an environment that says, we're changing. We're moving to a culture which is more gender balanced. We're moving to a culture which is at a workplace that's better for everybody. And this is the way we're doing it, and this is how we're leading on it, and this is the benefits that it's generating, not only to the individuals in the organization, but also to the company as well.
Yeah. Robert, I don't know where the time has gone, but we promised people half an hour and we are almost at time. But I know there may well be people who want to hear more about your latest initiative, who want to connect with you, who might have some questions they'd like to put to you. Where can they find you?
Well, I think LinkedIn's the best place these days, and so you can find me individually on LinkedIn. That's probably the best place to start. And I also have a company LinkedIn page, but by all means, come and connect with me on LinkedIn as a starting point. I'd love to have a conversation with you about how we can, do great things together to really make the world a better place, to create that gender equity that we need, and to really get men showing up and doing, their fair share of that.
Brilliant. So grateful for your time, Robert. Those insights, those practical strategies, the advice there, the reflections on what you're witnessing and seeing, and how we can approach this subject. So thank you very much for your time. Please, as you are leaving today, leave any thoughts about what has kind of caught your imagination. If you're watching the replay, as again, continue the conversation, because we will be monitoring those comments. So if you do have questions, we'll be coming back to them. And just to say, do join us next month. I mean, we're almost there. My goodness me, it's how did it get to be March already? But on March the 19th, that's a Tuesday, I will be speaking to the brilliant Lee Chambers, gender equity and menopause advocate, and inviting his reflection to National Women's Day, which God forbid people on this call don't know when that is, but that's the 8th of March. So that's nearly upon us. But do join us for our next Breaking Barriers LinkedIn Live. We would love to see you. And in the meantime, you're very welcome to connect again with me or any member of the Shape Talent team if gender equity is something that you and your organization want to get serious about. So Robert, thank you very much. Thank you everybody for joining us today. Cheerio.